For a wine to get a perfect score, whatever it would be, like 5 stars, 100 points, 20 points, from you, what qualities it should have?
Well, first of all, I think it's a nonsense.
Okay.
So I can use them, I do use them, I need to use them as a professional, but if you were to ask me to say whether they really made any sense or not, I would say no.
I'm looking in Burgundy and I'm kind of, that is getting out of my hand with every day.
And you don't mind if you can't own a Rolls Royce, but you do mind if you can't drink the occasional bottle of de Mendel-Aromni-Conti.
Exactly, exactly. Hi, everybody. This is Agnes from No Sediment, and welcome to No Sediment Wine Podcast. Today, my guest is Michael Schuster, who has spent a lifetime teaching and writing about wine. Hi, how are you?
Hi, I'm fine. Glad to be here. It's always lovely to be in Riga.
I'm very excited to have you.
Yeah, well, me too. I like talking.
About wine. But before we kind of talk more specifically about wine and wine tasting, how did you get into the world of wine?
Yeah, I was, it's quite funny. I wasn't interested in wine at all. I was born and brought up in Kenya, and as far as I knew, there was no wine there. And I left Kenya when I was just about 15, and my father died at that time. My mother wasn't interested in wine. When I went to university and with friends, we bought cheap Riesling, Lasky Riesling, and I can't remember what the reds were. So if you went to a party, you brought a bottle of wine, but I knew nothing about it. And for my 25th birthday in 1973, my mother's brother, who was interested in wine and food, he gave me 25 bottles of wine. They weren't particularly fancy. There were 6 bottles of white Burgundy, 6 bottles of red Burgundy. There were generic village Burgundies. There were 12 half bottles of Mouton Cadet and a bottle of 1970 Pichon Baron. And he wrote me a lovely letter with it, and he said, "It's time you learnt about this." And for the same birthday, my closest friend gave me Hugh Johnson's first book on wine. And the two together just got me interested. And I was then teaching near Peterborough. And in Peterborough, there was a lovely old wine merchant, which doesn't exist anymore, called Peyton's. And they sold, a lot of really quite fancy Bordeaux, and a lot of it in half bottles, which was great for experimenting. I then discovered that I was teaching English and music at the time, but I didn't want to spend a lifetime in the school classroom. So I came down to London. London was a wonderful place to discover wine. And I thought, well, what shall I do? I did a TEFL course because I thought I can go around the world with that and earn a living. That's teaching English as a foreign language. And I thought, I'll go to Bordeaux. And so the business where I was teaching English to foreign businessmen, I told them, look, I'm going to go. And they were very sad to lose me, but I had to give 3 months' notice. And 2 weeks before I left, the boss called me into his office and he said, "We've got a job for you in Bordeaux, if you'd like that." So, had I fallen on my feet or what? And so I went to Bordeaux, and I was teaching. I taught the Total Oil Company scientists. There were 12 of them. I taught them at 3 different levels, 4 days a week. And on the Monday I had free, and on Saturday mornings and Monday mornings I was doing the tasting diploma at the university. So that's how I learned about the technical side of wine and about blind tasting and about my thresholds of perception and so on. And then I came back after 2 years and went into business with a friend. It was a shotgun marriage and it ended in divorce after 3 years, but I was a wine merchant for 3 years and got to know the wine trade and the wine writers because we invited them to come and taste our wares. And when I split up with my partner, Alex, my basement became free. And I thought, well, if I can run a wine school there, I'll combine teaching with writing. And that's what I've been doing ever since, and stopped really when COVID came along.
All right. Wow.
The broad story.
Wow.
And I met my wife in my classroom.
And you're still together.
Yes.
That's beautiful.
And she's a great cook.
I have to maybe invite myself whenever I'm in London.
Absolutely. Well, you have an invitation, you know that.
Yeah.
And Igaz can tell you it's it's a worthwhile trip for both of you.
Thank you. I have also tasted and judged many wines with you, so I know you are amazing wine taster. And I wanted to ask you, is that something that you specifically trained yourself, or was it a talent?
I don't think tasting is a talent. I think we can all be tasters, and we have the wherewithal. And basically, it's a question of motivation and of tasting and putting words with sensations and deciding how you want to form some sort of a structure which will help you taste wines practically and rapidly and so on. And because I knew so little about wine and had so little experience, I would sit down with 2 or 3 bottles of the same wine. I'd ask my then girlfriend to give them to me blind, so I didn't know what the order was in. And I would just have a big white sheet of paper and try and find as many differences between them as I could, and then see, for each of the wines, and then open them up and see what those differences were and relate them to the wine. And my teaching is based on comparison. I've always tasted in pairs, put comparable wines together to show, or not comparable, to show differences in style and quality. And I think that's the easiest way for people to begin to appreciate and understand the differences. And, as Andrew says, difference is just, it's what makes wine so interesting and, and fascinating endlessly. And, I'm 75 and I'm still discovering new things. I have a wonderful story about a German wine, which you can ask me about if you want to talk about blind tasting.
We cannot say it now?
No.
All right.
Well, I can tell you about it now. It's very recent. First of all, I don't think blind tasting is the best method of judging wine. It's an important and it's a useful method of judging wine, but I think that you simply can't take into account all the necessaries, if you like, and it's very easy to misjudge as well. What we do in competitions, I think, is absolutely valid, because there you are tasting like against like. You know what the prices are, you know what to expect, and then you have half a dozen wines in front of you, or whatever it is, 50 as an overall group or something like that, and there you can say, this, for what it is really good value, and that is so useful for the consumer, particularly for the consumer who doesn't buy expensive wine, who wouldn't think of spending more than 20 euros. But for the person who will spend more than 20 euros, we taste wines that are more expensive, and they want to know, particularly if I am going to spend that much, what's really good for that price. And from that point of view, it's very useful. But I've long stopped tasting blind at the dinner table because I think it's a complete distraction. And fine wines, by the time you find out what it is, there's nothing left to enjoy. So we don't do it anymore. But I was with Serena Sutcliffe and David Peppercorn for David's 92nd birthday with Monica. We were just 4 around the table a couple of months ago. And when we sat down to table, and we have lovely food and wine with them, and when they come to us, but we don't normally blind taste. However, there was a white wine in the glass. David had poured it just before we sat down. And he said, I'd like you to taste that blind. And Serena said, come on, darling, we don't do that anymore. He said, yes, but this will be interesting, just to start with. And so Monica and I dipped our noses in and smelt it. It smelt like Riesling immediately, German Riesling. We tasted it, yes, German Riesling. But still a nice colour. There was a bit of maturity, clearly, and we thought this has got to be from a hot vintage. It was dryish. It, and probably had 13% alcohol or something like that. So it wasn't a Spätlese or anything like that. But we said this probably comes from, with this sort of age, from a fine mature vintage, something like 1983. So 83 Riesling from Germany. We can't really go much further than that. And David beamed, and he said, "No, it's from Germany." But it's not 1983, it's 1893.
Wow.
It was just astonishing. And the vineyard doesn't exist anymore. And it's not from one of the top regions, it's from the Rhine front, sort of in front on the river, if you like, sort of where so much of the sort of Liebfraumilch style comes from. It was just remarkable.
Wow,
and
amazing.
Wine has this capacity to astonish us for all sorts of reasons, and that was one of them.
Wow,
So
that's a really beautiful story.
Yeah.
But if we circle back to the wine tastings, what is important when you do taste wines, like taking notes, spitting, paying attention to the wine?
You know, the interesting thing when you do the sort of thing that I do is that for practically everything that you taste, but of course not the lesser wines, there becomes a sort of compulsion to make notes. It's for two reasons. I mean, making a note does two things. It first of all, it makes you pay attention. That's the most important thing. If you're in the business of writing about wine, you then have a record and you situate it, even if only mentally, but you've got it in writing as well. So I sort of make notes compulsively now. And, that little book that I've got there from when I started is just interesting to look back at. The most important thing is, do I like it? Is it giving me pleasure? I want it to be a joyful thing, or in one way or another. And, I have a hugely Catholic taste. I get almost as much pleasure from a really nice Picpoul de Pinet, or a Petit Chablis, or the Austrian, what's the grape variety?
The Gruner? No.
Yes, the Gruner Veltliner, absolutely, or from a good Gruner Veltliner. And, I get as much pleasure as that, in a different way and a simpler way, as I do from tasting a really fine old wine at 30 or 40 years old, which is astonishing too. So pleasure is the most important thing. And of course, you think when you do what we do, you think, how good is this for what it is? And that, of course, relates to the notion of what's typical and typicity and so on and so forth. But yes, that. But when we drink wine every day, but we mostly drink simple wines. But we're lucky enough to have in the cellar, because of what I've been doing for so long, lots of fine old wines as well. Because when I was when I was teaching, I had to have the basic wines anyway, but those you could go out and buy. But for the fine wine course, I wanted to have mature examples, so we needed to buy those in advance. And for the Master of Wine blind tasting, I had to have stuff from everywhere. And for some of the more unusual wines, you couldn't buy them off the shelf in individual bottles, so you had to buy packs of 6. And so I've still got some of those left. So if you come to our house, I say, what would you like? Name a country. And, I'm almost certain I can provide it.
Okay. But you just mentioned Master of Wine tasting, and there is a quite famous wine tasting book among students of Masters of Wine, written by Master of Wine Nick Jackson, and it's called Beyond Flavor. So, and where he focuses on wine structure, like the tannin acidity, rather than aromas and flavors.
Yeah.
So for you, how important are these structural elements in wine versus the aroma and flavors?
Well, structure, of course, is important. If this is a book that's been written for blind tasters, tasting for the Master of Wine, that's absolutely crucial, because structure is the first thing that you look for. And of course, structure is part of the wine. It's like saying, what's important for you to be a human being? Well, to be the way that we are. And so, of course, it's important. And the different structures, of course, are part of what make the differences in wine so attractive. And people like different things. Some of us like wines which are fresher and have a bit more acidity and are rather lighter. Others like wines that are fuller. In the case of red wines, darker with more tannin and more bite and so on. There's a huge variety of tastes. But of course, I mean, I haven't, what's the name of the author?
Nick Jackson.
Yeah, I haven't read Nick's book, but it would be interesting to look at. But of course, I think for blind tasting to identify, I think that, of course, that's absolutely crucial.
It's very small, like a pocket book like this.
Because that's very much part of the identity of a wine. And when I take notes, it's funny. I think Andrew said in the interview that you did with him that he could recognize many people's. If he were shown a wine note blind, he could probably say whose it was. Yeah. And my tasting, and this comes partly from my training in Bordeaux, and partly because I just wanted it to be easy, is that of course I do the smell first, but then I do the structure of the wine before I talk about the tastes and the quality. And this is sort of second nature now. When I'm doing blind tasting for the competition that we do together, that's different. You have to taste much more rapidly, and you're not really making notes, certainly not in any detail for people. So yeah, we all have our ways of thinking about wine, and structure, of course, is hugely important for identification, because the amount of alcohol, the level of acidity, will almost immediately give you some idea of whether it comes from a warmer climate or a cooler climate, and that limits you immediately. Yeah. And then you look at other things such as the grape variety and so on. So yeah, it's an interesting way to look at it, of course.
Yeah. I always think sometimes. When we just look blindly on the flavors and you say for a red wine, I don't know, Sangiovese, like red cherries, crunchy fruit, and it can be very repetitive.
Yes.
And then the structure
the structure is much more important than that. And there was a stage, I think, back in the 80s and 90s, where wine critics or wine writers used to describe wines as though the only analogies they had were a wheelbarrow full of fruit and vegetables. I think also of course it's important to identify individual flavors and individual characteristics, but I make the analogy in my book of this is a little bit like identifying the colors in a painting, but without saying how they're put together. And it's the how they're put together that is what really matters, and that gives you different harmonies and different proportions, and brings out different characteristics and so on. So structure is hugely important, and that's what I do when I start. And then I talk about I don't talk about individual flavors that much. I talk about quality in terms of how the wine performs in the mouth and how it tastes after you've swallowed it and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I relate that, of course, to the grape variety and where it comes from.
Sure. You briefly touched about the tasting blind. I have written here a question, why is it important to taste blind? But you just said that you don't necessarily think...
Well, as I said earlier, I think the most important use for tasting blind, it has two really useful reasons for doing. And the first is training yourself, because then it forces you, as I said, to look carefully. So it's crucial for that. And it's a very useful tool in the wine business, in the trade, for lining up a bunch of wines of the same type at the same price. So you don't know the producer with whom you may have a particularly good relationship and so on, just tasting through them. You don't need necessarily to make notes. You just say, this Beaujolais, this village Beaujolais from this year at under £10, we've got a dozen of them here. And, 3 of them are terrible. We'd never touch those. 2 of them stand out way above the rest, and then there's 6 of them that are sort of in between. And then you'll unmask them, and you'll see those 2, and you say, that one I know, that's no surprise, but I hadn't come across that before. Let's go and look at that. So it's a very useful tool for that. But the thing about blind tasting, when we're trying to assess wines as professionals and as the public, is we don't drink blind. And when we drink wine, and I mentioned this to you before we started, especially if the wine is more than just a very simple wine, which of course can give great pleasure, is it has all sorts of associations which go beyond just the flavor in the mouth. The people that you're with around the table, the occasion, the wine itself, how much you like it or don't like it, where it fits into the current world, and this kind of thing. There are all sorts of things you can talk about, which is what Andrew does in his book when he talks about wine. He very rarely gives wine notes as such. And, so for that reason, these are all things that blind tasting can't take into account, and neither can scoring for that matter. Don't get me onto that, at least not for any length of time.
It's wine scoring. Actually, my next question is a bit related, because I've seen it several times that and it is actually a similar question I asked also to Andrew. I've seen several times that very highly regarded and well-respected wines in these blind tastings or judging don't do so well.
Yeah.
And I just wonder why. Because, we see Krug and we just, oh, that's amazing wine. And then when we close everything and it's just, naked wine.
Yeah. Well, I think the point about that is that we don't taste wine naked. We need to know what it is. And you mentioned Cotta as being an example which was very different from the standard Sancerre.
Yeah.
Now, the Sancerre appellation authorities may say that's we can talk about typicity, it's more complicated, but that's not a good example of Sancerre. In a way, that's right, and in a way, it's nonsense. And in a lineup of stereotypical Sancerres, it would stand out as being not part of the norm, and therefore perhaps not what you would consider typical. Typicity is important, and we can come to that, because wines have, when people make wines, they have different ideals in mind, and sometimes these are not exactly what you would expect, and you can't take that into account when you blind taste. If you're blind tasting in big peer groups, you have a sort of generic ideal in mind, and if one or two wines don't fit into that, they tend to get marked down. But if you knew what they were, you would say, well, of course he's trying to do something completely different. And Cotta is a fine example in that, and rather less so than today than in the past. Some much more delicate Saint-Emilions and Margaux, for example, in Bordeaux, would be marked down, especially during the Parker period. I have to say I admire Parker as a taster. But they didn't fit the image of, or they didn't fit the ideal of the moment, and so they were marked down. Whereas if you had them at table, and if you were to spend a bit of time with them, you'd fall in love with them in no time, but for different reasons than you were falling in love with the blind tasting table.
But if we touch the typicity question a bit, so when do we taste, or at the moment when we taste the wines in the judging, how important for you is the typicity? Do you, if it is a typical wine for that specific label, it says Sancerre, would you score it down, or would you say it's not typical?
I would say it's a broad guidepost, if you like. But the other thing one has to remember when doing these tastings, and in the same way as when one's writing, is that you always have an audience in mind. And so for them, it doesn't really matter whether, if you had a Cotta, for example, in the Sancerres, you would think, well, this is a bit of an oddball. If you recognize it, you would mark it very highly. But it's not what you would promote to most people who want a Sancerre, because Sancerre to them, and the name is important. When we buy fruit, we buy an apple because we want an apple experience. We buy a peach because we want a peach experience. And when you buy a bottle of wine,
I like this comparison.
The only guide that you have is the label.
Yeah.
And if you buy a Sancerre and it tastes like a Chardonnay from southern France, you're going to be utterly confused and say this is a nonsense. So from that point of view, typicality, or typicity as we call it in wine vocabulary, is actually very important. But of course it can also be a straitjacket, and it's a straitjacket in the hands of the authorities who say we have in mind a typicity for what Sancerre is, or what Grand Cru Classé Saint-Emilion is, and if that doesn't fit into that, then we don't want to give it the appellation, and that's a sort of nonsense. But authorities find it much easier to work to rules, and rules they don't like bending them.
Yeah.
And of course they have to think a bit if they're bending them, and they don't like doing that.
Yeah, that's true.
So for that reason, typicity is important from that point of view. It provides a compass of some kind, and without it, we'd all be lost.
That's true. But I really like that you said that the comparison with fruit. Yes, that's true. Mm. That's completely true. But also when we are tasting wines for judging, do you keep in mind who will be drinking the wine?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. As I said, the audience is very important. When you're talking about a wine under 10 euros, first of all, it won't have as much to say to you, but you won't have as much to say about it. And people who are buying wines for under 10 euros, they just want to know, is it any good? If you're looking at wines which are over 20 euros, and particularly wines which are expensive, and this year, for the first time in the Riga Top 100, we tasted wines which were over 100 euros. Of course, you have hugely different expectations, as of course you need to have, because you're paying such a lot of money for them, so you want more from them, and you judge them much more critically. You look at them in more detail, you make more detailed notes and so on. So yes, the audience is crucial. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. I just sometimes wonder that we as a wine professionals usually enjoy completely different wines that maybe less engaged wine consumers would.
No, you have to. And you have to be able to think like the people whom you're writing for or talking to. And one of the interesting things for me, and it's interesting for all sorts of reasons, is that when I had my on my beginner's course, I had an evening where we did German wines. And so we had a Spätlese, we had a Cabernet, a Spätlese, and an Auslese. And in that lineup of four, I put a Blue Nun.
Mm.
And a Blue Nun, of course, is a very generic wine. People are awfully rude about it. I think it's a very well-made wine, which appeals to a lot of people. And so we would taste all of these, and I would say, and let's say this is a group of 20 or 14, depending on whether it was one bottle or two bottle tasting. I'd say, hands up, who liked wine number 1 best, Cabernet, who liked wine number 2 best, the Spätlese, who liked wine number 3 best, the Blue Nun, who liked wine number 4 best, the Auslese. And every time we did this, about 60% of the room liked the Blue Nun the best, because they were beginners. Sort of by definition, they wanted something that was easy, that wasn't demanding, that was supple, didn't have a lot of acidity, was medium sweet. And, these days it's a very clean wine. It's a very well-made wine. And I think to be rude about it is silly. But of course, you get beyond it very quickly. So, if you have those people in front of you, you talk to them about wine at a different level. But as they get to know a bit more about vocabulary, a little bit more about what to look for and so on, you can, you can take it up a step. But you have to have their palates in mind when you're writing about them. And I write for the World of Fine Wine differently, for example, than I used to write for a monthly which came out in the city, and where I knew the sort of price which people were looking to buy at was, between 15 and 20 pounds. But that's above the beginner level. I don't know about in Riga or in Latvia, but still in the UK, the vast majority of wine that is purchased is way under 10 euros. I'm just getting close now to having to be over that simply because of inflation.
Yes.
But that's what most people drink. And, you and I are complete wine nerds. And there is a small proportion of people who are not in the business who are wine nerds and to whom you talk about wine differently. And it's an interesting question there. Andrew and I just reviewed the 2019 Bordeaux at 4 years. And he tastes with me, and so now does Simon Field, who's taken on Bordeaux en primeur from me. And I think Simon doesn't put any drinking dates. I put quite detailed drinking dates, which I think about a bit, not too hard, because they're very broad. But and I mentioned, because I just saw this in Andrew's notes, almost everything, he advises that you open instantly. And when he read my introduction, he said, but most people these days don't have cellars, and so they don't buy wine to keep. But the point is, we're writing for the World of Fine Wine magazine, and actually a very large number of these people will have cellars, and a sort of definition of fine wine, or at least one of the most important defining characteristics of fine wine, is that it has the ability to age and to improve over a long time. And, this is not a boast, it just happens to be the case. Last year was 2022, and so, as did many of us in the wine business, we tried to taste as many 1982s from Bordeaux as we could. And I'm lucky still to have a few bottles of 1982 first growths. And so Andrew and I, on one occasion, a friend of ours has some bottles of Latour, and I bought a bottle of Mouton. And we just spent an afternoon with those two wines, and Andrew wrote it up for the World of Fine Wine. And the point is, these were astonishing at 40 years. And they've been very good over the previous 30. They were wonderful in barrel, and I've still got my barrel note and so on. But I mean, they were just extraordinary, and we decanted them. Andrew and I then spent 20 minutes making notes because he was going to write it up. whilst Monica and our friend enjoyed champagne. But then we sat with the decanters at table, and we enjoyed them over the next couple of hours. Just 2 bottles between 4 of us. It was wonderful, and so that is the point is that's a very different audience.
Yes,
and you need to talk to them from a different point of view, and from their point of view, if you like, and to recognize that that's what they want to know.
I really like this comparison. Yes, because Andrew also in the interview, he told that he really thinks that majority of wine should be drunk young enough to catch the fruit.
Yeah, and of course that's true, because the fruit is there in abundance, but what you don't have is the bouquet, and what you don't have is the mellowness of texture.
Yeah,
and that's one of the great appeals of fine mature wine. Of course, not all, in inverted commas, fine wine matures beautifully, but when the best ones do, it's something which is utterly extraordinary. I spent a similar evening with another friend of mine and his wife. We were just the 4 of us. This was 2 weeks ago, and we've all got these old rare bottles which we don't want to sell unless we're absolutely forced to. But I said to him, when he said, "What's the next one of these that we'll do?" Because we'd done an 82 first growth tasting with him, I said, "But look, how about I've got some bottles of 1990 Chave. Do you have any 89? He said, "Yes, I've got an 89. I'll go and get it for you." And so that went into the cellar, and we had those a couple of weeks ago. And it's winter, so it was dark when they came at 6:30. And we just sat at the table. The only light that was on was the light on the dining room table. And I thought afterwards, that was a sort of cocoon of friendship, of beauty, of wonderful food, of discussion around a couple of the most astonishing wines. And that's at the sort of top end of the fine wine experience, and you only have that once or twice a year. But it's a memory which nourishes you in a way that makes you understand fine wine and the stupid prices.
I think that's a completely different topic I would want to one day tackle. But yeah, wine is becoming more and more expensive. That's true.
Fine wine is becoming more and more expensive.
Yes.
There are many more wealthy people in the world, and many more people know about what's best. It's a simple supply and demand function.
Yeah. I mean, I'm looking in Burgundy, and I'm kind of, that is getting out of my hand with every day. And
you don't mind if you can't own a Rolls Royce, but you do mind if you can't drink the occasional bottle of Domaine de la Romanée-Conti.
Exactly. But I want to talk a bit about scores. But the first question would be...
About sports?
Scores. Wine scores.
Wine courses?
Scores.
Scores,
yeah,
sorry.
Sorry.
I'm going deaf.
No, my pronunciation is wrong. I will try one more time. I want to talk about wine scores. But first...
Whilst you're there, it's scores.
Scores.
That's why I couldn't understand it. You pronounce the last S like a Z. Wine scores.
Wine scores.
That's it.
Okay.
Then I'd have understood it.
So I want to talk about wine scores.
Yes.
Perfect. For a wine to get a perfect score, whatever it would be, like 5 stars, 100 points, 20 points, from you, what qualities it should have?
Well, first of all, I think it's a nonsense.
Okay. Because my next question would be what you think of wine scores in general.
But and this is it's one of course, we all use scores, and we use them as journalists because that's what our readers want to have, and it's important for them. But one of the big problems with wine scores is, you don't have it with wine medals, that's different, and we can make the comparison. But with wine scores, it's very difficult to decide whether there is just one set of figures for the whole world of wine, in which case Petit Chablis and Picpoul de Pinet are right down here, which is idiotic, or else you have a possible perfection score of 100 for each wine, and that's equally impossible. And that's really the problem, because a perfect, I've mentioned it before because it's one of our regular drinks, a perfect Petit Chablis is just delicious. And for the winemaker who's making it, he will say, look, I taste lots of Petit Chablis. I know this is right at the top of the of what's made. I can't do any better. It should be getting 100 points, but nobody gives it 100 points, and that's really silly. But it's very difficult to accommodate that flexibility within something that is so precise, because it doesn't allow for flexibility, and that's its huge appeal, that it seems to be to offer precision actually where there is no precision. So I mean, I have a good sense of the calibration of sort of from 84 upwards. What used to be, I don't know exactly what my comparisons are, but it's around about 14 on the 20-point scale. And I know how to use them, and I use them with I use them for me fairly accurately. And what's interesting is that every now and again I go back, once I've marked up, let's say a 2010 Bordeaux, which I tasted in 2014 and I tasted last year, and I find my scores are very close. So I feel like at least I'm reasonably consistent, and I know that I can do the job where it's necessary. And it is necessary because for our readers, they want that. So from that point of view, it's good. And the other thing is, when Parker started this in the mid-80s, I think it was much more useful then than it is now, partly because it was mainly only used for Bordeaux. And it gave not only the people who were drinking Bordeaux a good idea of what was really good, what was good, and what wasn't as good as it ought to be. But today, all those wines are much, much better than they used to be, and the bunching at the top has just become ridiculous. So that for these 2019s, there's a big tasting in Sussex. I don't go to it because I do the tasting with Andrew. But Chateau Meunier, which is a wine I love, was getting 95, 96 points. And this just seemed to me absurd. This is a first growth score. And I mean, I tasted it with care next to some other Saint-Estèphes, next to Cos d'Estournel and Montrose and Lafont Rocher and so on. And I scored it a 91, which is a perfectly regular score. And that wasn't to say that what some of these other tasters had put was wrong, but it just seems to me it's actually not useful anymore. Because if you're scoring a good Cru Bourgeois at the same level as a top second or a first growth, what's it telling you? And people don't look, all of us say, read my notes, don't look at my scores. But people don't do that anymore. They see the score and they think, okay, so, that's 96, 97, 98. Yeah, that's worth buying at price X or whatever. And the other thing is that these scores are now used for all sorts of wine all around the world. And actually, they're sort of meaningless. Medals, on the other hand, because if you score, let's take that Picpoul de Pinet example again. If you score that 85, which is probably a perfectly reasonable score for a good Picpoul de Pinet, people will say, well, actually, most of the people who buy that wine are not the least bit interested in scores. But what they are interested in is if they see a gold medal there, then they'll say, that's got a gold medal or a silver medal, that's good. And, that makes a great deal more sense. So I just think that the currency of scores is getting less and less useful. But people want certainty, and the number gives them certainty, even if that certainty is illusory. So
you think it's nonsense?
So I can use them. I do use them. I need to use them as a professional. Yeah. But if you were to ask me to say whether they really made any sense or not, I would say no. I think that Andrew's phrase is that they're philosophically untenable. Yeah, absolutely.
But from you to get like a gold medal then, so what would wine need to have?
Well, for what it is, and of course you judge it for what it is, and that's very important. And within a category, the most important thing is that it should just be delicious. And if you start from that point of view, that's of course where the consumer starts. He wants to unscrew the cap or draw the cork and say yum yum. And so that's the most important thing, and then you can look at other things and decide, is this actually a gold, or is it, can I think of something more delicious of this type? And there may be another one further along. And then you categorize like that and decide whether it's a gold or a silver or whatever. It's comparative necessarily, implicitly. And when we do it at the at the judging bench, of course, it's practically comparative as well. Yeah. So joy is the most important thing.
Yes, this is Andrew, and you keep saying that.
Yeah, because that's the point. And when we drink simple wines at the table, whether it's a red, we've got a wonderful Bourgogne Rouge at the moment, which we buy for under £20, and because people don't recognise it for what it is, often it's under £10 on offer, and we just think this is mad. And my sister, who is not in the least bit interested in wine, she enjoys that with her husband. So we've bought vast quantities of this, and passed it on to sisters and friends and so on. And it's not grand wine, but it's a lovely drink.
Yes,
and that's the point.
So I have a few more questions left, and one is, do you think wine vocabulary is limiting us in describing wine?
Wine vocabulary limits you if your wine vocabulary is limited.
Oh.
And I think it's the duty of anyone who's seriously trying to communicate about wine to have a rich vocabulary. And we can develop our vocabulary throughout our lives. And this is I think it's a sort of duty. But the other thing about wine vocabulary is that you need it. There are two sides to the coin here. You need the word to recognize the sensation. When dogs and children, for example, we know are super sensitive to most of what we won't go into this, but most of what we taste is smell. And there are people who are called super tasters because they seem to be super sensitive. But you're not really a super taster unless you can communicate that. And for that you need the words, but you also need the words to notice the sensation and to articulate it. And that's a question of training. And so I think your ability to describe a wine is only as limited as your ability to imagine and to use words. And and I think that's very important. And I'm constantly thinking, about what words I can use. And in the old days, I had a thesaurus, which I used to use regularly. I'd have a word and I'd go to the thesaurus and I can look it up. Today, I have Merriam-Webster, which has its own thesaurus and is much easier to consult. And I use that all the time, and I find it very useful. And it enlarges my vocabulary. And it helps, when you put into words what you experience, then you experience it more closely and with more pleasure. And if we were to drink a bottle of grand wine between us and neither of us said anything, there would be nothing like the same pleasure than there would be when we're talking about it. And for that you need words. And you need words at different levels for different people and different wines and so on. So it's hugely important vocabulary. But one doesn't talk about wines just in terms of words. You talk about them in terms of many other things. Associations and points in time and history and friendships and special occasions and blah, blah, blah. And that has nothing to do with blind tasting. Another reason why blind tasting is not as useful as it could be.
Yes. I wanted to talk about another one of your passions, which is, if I understand correctly, music.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, do you sometimes pair wine with music? Or is it not?
No, it's a very good question. It's an interesting question, and I think this is quite funny. When we were Andrew and I, because Andrew's such a good friend, we talk about this a lot together. But when we were about to taste the 2018 Bordeaux vintage, Andrew looked back at my introduction, my en primeur introduction. He said, "I see you describe it as Wagnerian." So I'm listening to Götterdämmerung in preparation. There are lots of similarities between wine and music. Not least, they don't have their own language, and so we have to borrow words and phrases from elsewhere, which is fine. We use words in all sorts of different contexts, and we understand that. And it's also an interesting question because 20 years ago now, I think, or something like that, Berry Brothers in London asked me to do an evening of wine and music, and which is what I then did. And we had, I think we had half a dozen wines, which I'd selected from Berry Brothers, and I put some music with them, and we had the wines, and I don't know, there must have been 30 or 40 of us down in the room, And I actually brought my own speakers and audio system because they had such a poor one. They were very happy to stick it in. Yeah, and we had wine and music, but it's not something I think about very often. I think the parallels that you can draw between them are actually very limited.
Okay.
What about you? What do you think?
I have never tried to do that.
There you are.
But I would really like to actually participate in that Berry Brothers wine and music experience. I think that would be great. Because I think music can also give you like a lot, like it can like add certain emotions.
Yeah.
And then with those emotions, you go towards wine.
Yeah.
And so I think it kind of...
But it's a very artificial sort of pairing. And I mainly chose what some of my favorite pieces, but which would work with the wines we had, so that I wouldn't be, we wouldn't have been listening to Götterdämmerung or Siegfried or Beethoven's Ninth, for example, with a glass of German Riesling, and you can see why.
Yeah.
We'd been listening to Bach for that, or a string quintet or something like that.
I have one more question to go, but before that, I wanted to ask you: is there something that you wish to talk and I just didn't ask, or is there some more last thoughts that you would like to?
Well, I brought along one little prop which we've got under here, and which sort of says something about what we've been saying so far, and this goes back to 1979. And it's I've got the label here. I don't know if you want to see it a little bit more closely. The point about this is just talking about wine, and it was a special occasion, and it was a special wine. But this label is from a Magnum. This was purchased in, I would think, round about 1974. We drank the Magnum in 1979, and we'll come to that in a moment. But this has on it the price. This was brought at a sort of upmarket grocer in Cambridge. Here it's got 100 shillings. That's £5. And the 100 shillings is crossed out, and below it is 80 shillings. That's £4. £4 for a Magnum of one of the greatest post-war wines. I mean, it's just astonishing. But I thought, and I was in 1979, I was only just beginning to get into wine. Here's my, I don't know if you want to photograph this also with your thing. That's, I started a series of notebooks, and this is what I would use to make notes about everything that was in a glass in front of me. So that's the second one in 1979. And I've got the note here on this wine. I knew it was a special wine. I didn't really know how special, but for family and friends, for a Christmas meal, we decided to have 3 Margaux, which are 1964, 1966, and 1953. And if you want to take a photograph of that, you can bring the thing up, and it's just interesting to have. And there's the menu inside, and I made a special occasion of it, and I've got the menu inside, and I sewed the menu to it, and so on. But of course, the occasion was lovely, and we enjoyed ourselves. And I made a very careful note. And it's one of the greatest wines I've ever had. And I put down here quite superb. I didn't have much vocabulary then, but I put quite superb, elegant, light, very fine and feminine, still in good condition. This was at about 26 years. A lovely natural sweetness, an exceptional wine, a pleasure, a privilege. And with an aftertaste that just goes on and on and on, an absolutely lovely flavor. Rich without being at all heavy, so smooth, and so on and so forth. So, of course, I loved it. But the interesting thing about the label is that this situates it at an important point in history as well. 1974, which was when this would have been bought, was just after the oil crisis, and it was also just after the cruise scandal in Bordeaux, where wines were being sold by a very well-known name. It's not that they were bad wines or poor wines. It was that they said Bordeaux on the label, and the wines didn't come from Bordeaux, and that's a completely different story. But anyway, the market for Bordeaux, for both those reasons, and for fine wine in general, just bottomed. And for one to be able to buy a Magnum 1953 Margaux for £4 is just utterly astonishing. And the reason for that is because of where we were at that point in history. So it's a point in time, it's a family occasion, it's a fantastic wine. It's making a note about something so beautiful has situated it in my memory. And, it's part of my life's nourishment, if you like. And that's what fine wine is about. But it's also just what a bottle of, basic, crisp, juicy white wine is when we get back from work.
So the last question is one wine myth you would like to debunk?
One wine myth. There are so many. But I think a sort of useful myth to debunk is that wine gets better with age. Mostly it doesn't. I've just come from staying with family in Hamburg, and we went down this. I've still got an old cousin, my father's first cousin, who's now 93, and his brother, who is now dead, has a cellar. His daughter is looking after the house, and she wants to sell it. And we hadn't actually met before, but she knew I was a wine expert. So I was invited down to the cellar to tell her if there were any treasures there. And there must have been about 60 bottles of wine. There was not a single treasure amongst them. They were all cabinets and Spätlesers from 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. And she doesn't drink wine. And I said to her, 99% of this is to throw away. Just because it's old doesn't mean it's good. And most wines are meant to be drunk best young. But the interesting thing was, there were 4 bottles of a Spätleser. I said, we'll bring 3 of these bottles up and just draw the cork if we can get it out and see what they have to say. One of them was a 1959 Spätleser, which smelled lovely, actually. It still smelled of nice Riesling, but it was completely dead. And then there was a 1975 Spätleser from the Erdenertraction. And with a winemaker called Simon. I mean, there are several Simons whom I didn't know. So the possibilities here were quite promising. And when we drew the cork on that, what I said to them was, it's, what you can certainly say about this is it's nicht untrinkbar. So it's not undrinkable. And in fact, we had it with our meal. And one of us added a little bit of spritz. And the extraordinary thing was that a 50-year-old Spätleser should be drinkable at all. That was astonishing. But mostly wines are to be drunk young. Andrew says they're to be drunk young even if they're fine. But I say they're to be drunk young. And, for most people, when you buy it, open it. Drink it within 6 months. That's what they're mainly made for.
Perfect.
All right.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time and coming here in this cold and gray weather.
No, it's fun to do.
A lot.
Fun to do.
I have one small gift. I haven't seen you wear anything like this, but this is the No Sediment logo.
That's great.
And
that's great.
Maybe, yeah.
I think what you do actually is fantastic.
Yeah.
So
it actually suits you very well.
How's that?
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Perfect.
It's been great fun.